Ward Farnsworth is Professor of Law and holder of the W. Page Keeton Chair at the University of Texas at Austin. He served as Dean of the School of Law from 2012 to 2022, and he has served as a law clerk to Anthony M. Kennedy of the United States Supreme Court and worked as a legal advisor to the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal in The Hague. He's the author also of a number of books, including The Practicing Stoic, The Socratic Method, and also a series on English, the Classical English Rhetoric, Classical English Metaphor, and Classical English Style, as well as some other books on chess as well. So, Ward Farnsworth, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me, can I ask you first? I mean, I've been reading your book, The Socratic Method. How did you come to write a book like this on the Socratic Method, a practitioner's handbook subtitled?
Well, I just thought it was needed because I thought Socrates is in sort of a curious posture in our intellectual culture. I think Socrates might be the most illustrious name in the history of Western thought. But I also think most people would struggle to identify any way in which they feel they owe much to him directly. Most people might associate him with the idea that the unexamined life isn't worth living. But in terms of any direct value, how many people could describe themselves as Socratics or as trying to, in their own thinking, carry out anything that he, in particular, that he stood for? And it seemed to me that in prior generations, a lot of thinkers, people like John Stuart Mill, they really thought of Socrates and his method as being the greatest inheritance we have from the classical era. And I thought maybe there's something useful to be done here. The Socratic method is, in my view, we'll talk about it, a wonderful thing, but it's never directly explained in any of the dialogues of Plato. It's just something you have to infer from reading the dialogues. And I thought, what if somebody tried to work backwards from the dialogues and explain what the method is and how it works and how it might be of some practical value? That was my hope, is that this hadn't been done yet and it would be useful to somebody if I did it.
Well, I think you've done it rather well. I mean, I have a number of books on the Socratic method. I've picked up a few over the years, but I think yours by far is the clearest and the most analytical in the sense of getting to the heart of the matter. And one of the things I liked was, I mean, right at the very beginning of the book, right on the first page of the book, you set the scene, really, because he says here in the preface, you say, Socrates didn't question people in order to teach us how to question people. He did it in order to teach us how to think. I wonder, is that something that's particularly needed in this day? I mean, we're 2,000 and more, 2,300 years or more beyond the time of Socrates. Do we think just as clearly as they did, or is there something still to learn from the Socratic method for us?
Well, first, let me say I'm grateful to you for mentioning that distinction, because I worry the Socratic method has a reputation. It's basically a thing you do to other people. It's a technique for professors or others to use to put people on the spot. And I just think that's a way that it gets shown. In fact, the Socratic method is something you do internally. It's a way to think about things for yourself. And that's misconception number one that I hope to clear up about the method. But on your direct question, I don't know. It is hard not to sometimes think that our habits of discourse are declining, and I do often have that thought. On the other hand, I think it often seems that way, and I think if you part of reading the dialogues is concluding that a lot of the basic problems that human beings have in thinking clearly are just about constant. They were very serious in old Athens. They were very serious when Mill was dealing with them in the 19th century. They're very serious now. I think we have some special reasons now to be worried about the state of discourse and thought on hard questions. But I think in a lot of ways, the fundamental issue the Socratic method means to respond to, it's always been there and it's always going to be there as long as people's minds work the way they do.
So have we fallen into a kind of a mode of lazy thinking in the 21st century? Do we not actually reach the standard of Socrates and the Greeks, or are we I mean, are we thinking as we ought to be thinking? Is it as you might expect a more modern society to behave?
Well, I think at the let's be clear, first of all, we've made a lot of progress in our thinking. Most people would conclude there are a lot of things I think most people would regard as topics in which we all see with more moral clarity now than we did 100 years ago, let alone 1 or 2,000 years ago. But at the margins where the controversies exist, I think we often do a very bad job. And I don't, the question is, are we doing any worse than we've ever done? I don't think we've solved the great problems of how to think clearly about things. Most people engage in constantly motivated reasoning about ethical issues. They're easily satisfied with arguments that lead to the conclusions they like. That's how people are. It's how they've always been. It's how they are now. I think the main danger is the self-satisfaction of thinking we've got that licked. That used to be a problem. We do much better now. I don't think we do better now. We might do worse now.
Might do worse. If you'll forgive me, another quotation from the book, which reminded me of might do worse now, was you mentioned, if I can find it, one word which I think you said summarizes for you the exact opposite of the Socratic method. And in fact, I can't pin it down now, but it's I've got it.
Well, I can tell you what it said. It's what it said was because
the word was Twitter. Yes.
The word is Twitter, which I guess is no longer the right word now. It'd be X or something. But
X,
Socrates likes to often define ideas by saying, well, what's the opposite? If we're not sure what good is, are we at least sure what evil is? And I think if you were to try to define the Socratic method by finding an opposite of it, I suggested half jokingly that the word might be Twitter, because I think social media is a kind of accelerant of bad habits of thought. It really encourages people to be satisfied with smugness, to be most in search of just confirmation of what they already think, rather than inviting civil challenge of it and dissent and refinement of your thinking by testing it against opposition. I think social media invites all the bad habits of thought that the Socratic method is meant to push back against. And that is the respect in which I worry that we might be a little worse off in recent times than we were before, because I think social media trains people to think in ways that are very impatient, very intolerant of others, and very easily satisfied with too little self-reflection.
I mean, Twitter's associated with the idea of the quick, clever put down, isn't it? Because it's only got a small number of characters, and you can dismiss people that kind of way. And people also, some people think of the Socratic method as a kind of a put down mechanism, but you're saying it's not that, it's something else.
Right. So I mentioned one misconception earlier, which is that the Socratic method is mostly a device for testing others. But even when it is used conversationally, if it's used properly, it's definitely not that. I think some people they think of themselves as not fans of the Socratic method because their exposure to it was a brief reading of a Platonic dialogue where they saw Socrates seeming to be sarcastic, splitting hairs, and generally being obnoxious to other people. And they thought, why would I want to be like that? And I think that if you sort of back out the Socratic method and think about the elements of it and how it's used at its best, which is often not in those moments that you remember best in the dialogues, but in other moments, it has a lot more to offer than you might have thought. Socrates does like to sort of put a pin into the pomposity of some of his interlocutors, but those are usually the pompous ones who think they know it all. And one of my claims in the book is that in real life discourse, that's almost never an appropriate attitude or approach to have to people you're talking to. The only party who really deserves the pinprick that explodes their pomposity is really the self. That's the right attitude to take toward your own overconfidence in your judgments. Sometimes you need to have a ruthless quality in dealing with yourself on those things because it's so easy to otherwise be self-satisfied. But when you're working with others, especially others who are not know-it-alls and are people you're actually trying to reason with in good faith, I think patience, compassion, empathy, all the human qualities that we appreciate most in daily life, those are central to the effective use of Socratic questioning and discussion.
Right. Would you say that, as a society today, we've fallen into kind of a lazy way of thinking, and the Socratic method is a kind of an antidote to that then? Is that a fair way to put it?
Well, I basically, yes. The only resistance I have is the resistance I've noted before, that I think that's generally the state of human thinking. That's, I think, the Socratic thesis. It's also what Mill thought. I mean, John Stuart Mill was a deep student of Socrates and the Socratic method. He published a lot of some of the first English translations of the Socratic dialogues, and he wrote a lot about them. And his view was the basic problems that Socrates was working against in Athens are just the same now in 19th century England. If you think we've made a lot of headway, you just don't understand the nature of the problem, which is that it's built into the way the human mind works. And I'd say now, with some distance between us and Mill, I'd say about the same thing, that we're all lazy thinkers. Have we fallen into lazy thinking, as you put it? Well, maybe, but I think we that's what we generally do. I'm not sure we're worse at it now than we were then. We're just always bad about that.
Yeah. I mean, Mill is classically known as one of the great liberals, liberal in this small L sense, not liberal in the American sense that you might use it over on your side of the large water there. But right. How much do you think of, it's probably an impossible question, how much do you think of Mill's classical liberalism is due to his thinking along the lines of Socrates, or his study of Socrates, and learning to think in that kind of way, because he's certainly a classic person of that nature?
Well, I don't think Socratic thinking leads you necessarily to classical liberalism. It can lead you to lots of places. But for Mill, it did. I mean, Mill's approach to social problems was to relentlessly question convention and ask what the presuppositions of it were and whether they held up to scrutiny. And that was, he described himself as a student of the Socratic method first and foremost. And so he would use it, for example, to question why women were excluded from politics or from various lines of work. And he would examine every argument and every commonplace that was offered in support of that idea. And he would say, look, none of this actually stands up. I understand it all seems obvious to everybody, but if you slow down and ask why it all seems obvious, it all falls apart. And he did that with law after law and convention after convention. And it led him to classical liberal conclusions that were basically skeptical in character. I mean, Mill's defense of free thought and free speech has been very inspiring to people ever since he wrote it. And I think that at its root has a kind of skepticism at the bottom of it, that the search for the truth never really comes to an end. We can never quite be satisfied we have our hands around it. And that's a Socratic value that he takes away from the dialogues and believes himself. And once you think that, things follow from it. I mean, there are things government cannot do once you've reached that conclusion. There are respects in which the government simply has to get out of the way and allow people to form their own beliefs about things. And that, I think, is one of the starting points of what we now think of as a classical liberal approach to social order.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've skirted around the idea of the need for the Socratic method. Can we actually come to the method itself? Can you introduce us to the Socratic method and just kind of step us through some of the more basic elements of what it would be involved in if you wanted to employ this technique?
I certainly will. Now, let me say first, it's hard sometimes to define the Socratic method because Plato doesn't do it. The Socratic method is just what we infer by way of method from what we watch Socrates doing in the dialogues. So there's a lot of ways to think about what it is, some of them grander than others. But let me just start by being practical. The Socratic method usually means the artful use of questioning to test positions, thoughts that people have, including oneself, usually by seeking to find agreement on values or principles or thoughts in the background, and then testing the holder of the view in the foreground for consistency. So they say they believe something in the foreground, and you say, well, can we also agree, though, about this other thing? And if they say yes, then you show there's tension between the other thing and what they thought. So it's essentially testing the truth of what people say for internal consistency with other things they think and believe. So a simple homey example would be somebody takes a position about a movie. That movie was terrible, couldn't stand it. You say, well, why is that? And they give you a reason. And you argue back and forth for a while. And then what you realize is maybe you have an underlying difference with this person about what counts as a good movie. It's not about this movie. It's about what counts as a good one. So you say, let's back up a minute. What's your idea of a good movie? What do you think makes them? And they give you another example. And you say, I'm sorry, I don't want examples. I mean, can you give me a definition of a good movie, of what a general principle about what makes a movie good? And they give you some definition. They say, well, it's all about character development. Well, then you say, all right, but let's think about, wasn't this character developed in the movie? Wasn't that character developed in the movie? And you test for consistency that way. Or you say it's about character development, but didn't you like this other movie? And the characters weren't developed much in that one, were they? So it sounds like you might need another definition. Or you say, character development, why do you think that's important? And then they go up a level of generality to give another reason why it might be important. And then you talk about that and do the same things. But there are these steps that Socrates takes when somebody offers a position in the foreground about what's good and what's bad. I mean, just take everything I just said and replace the word movie with the good life. And then you have the Socratic method used in its original home territory, which is taking claims about what's good and bad and what's right and wrong, and saying, well, why do you think that? What do you think makes something good or right? And somebody offers their view, and you say, okay, but now let's make sure that the conclusion you offer in the foreground doesn't satisfy your own definition. Maybe it does. Or let's test your definition. Are you sure that covers all the cases of good and bad and right and wrong that we care about? Or take the definition and ask, why is that the right definition? Let's up the generality and think about it more deeply. It's asking questions like these. And notice that none of these amount to saying to somebody, you're wrong. That's something that generally doesn't happen in Socratic dialogue. You're just wrong. What he always says is, interesting. Let me ask you some other questions. And tries to find some common point of departure, something we can agree about. So one of the most important expressions in Socratic questioning is always, can we agree? ... Can we at least agree on this? You're trying to find a point of departure we can both agree on. And then you test from that point of departure whether the point of potential disagreement is necessarily consistent with the thing we agree on. And in this way, it's possible, I think, to make more headway in dialogue than people usually do, because you're not denouncing the other side. You're not telling them they're wrong. You're saying, I hear what you're saying. I think I understand why you think it. But don't we also think this other thing over here? Let's think about whether we're being consistent. Most people are much more open to that kind of conversation than they are to plain old contradiction, which immediately makes them defensive and causes them to treat you as an enemy in the discussion. Socratic questioning, when it's done right, is collaborative reasoning. It's, let's think about what we agree on, and then let's think about the relationship between that and what we appear to disagree about.
So you don't have to say to someone, you're wrong on this or you're wrong on that, because by going along this search for consistency and any contradictions to try to analyze, people come to their own conclusion that they were wrong because the contradiction is then revealed. Yeah.
That's the classic Socratic approach, is that Socrates never says you're wrong. Socrates says, hold that thought. Let me ask you something else. And then he brings up what appears to be a somewhat distantly related hypothetical question or some other question, and gets agreement on that, and then works back to the original question and causes the person to realize, I'm not sure I can explain this. I'm not sure I can explain why what I said is true and this other thing is also true. I'm having trouble with that. And Socrates sort of shrugs and says, oh, well, let's talk more after you figured that one out. So the idea of Socratic questioning is to help people feel the tension in their own conclusions and other values they hold, and then to leave it there and let them conclude from that maybe they aren't as sure as they thought they were. The Socratic method, I think, is rarely a way to reverse somebody's opinions. I just think conversation in general rarely reverses anybody's opinions. What you more plausibly hope for is that with good questioning, you loosen the grip of somebody's opinion and make them more open to the possibility that maybe there's more to this than they thought. Whatever you're talking about, maybe they're wrong. Okay. And of course, ideally, you'd have to reach the same conclusion for yourself. You might loosen the grip of your own beliefs that you started the conversation with, and realize maybe there's more to this than I thought.
So, I mean, this search for contradiction, which seems to be like one of the primary stages of the Socratic method, that's you've given it a name in your chapter 6 here, the elenchus, which is this kind of search for finding where the contradictions might be. Now, this is where I think the genius of Socrates surely comes out, because you have to be able to see the beginning from the end a little bit, don't you? You have to be able to see a lot further than your interlocutor can see in order to be able to see where those contradictions might automatically lie. And
yes, that's right.
That's quite a difficult task to do.
Well, it is. It's hard under the best of circumstances. So I'm a law professor, and law professors use the Socratic method a lot. And it's easy for me to use it in class because I can plan in advance what we're going to talk about in the foreground, and then what hypothetical questions I'm going to ask the student. And then once they answer those questions, how I can connect the hypothetical back to the question in the foreground they've taken the opinion on, and create all sorts of wonderful contradictions and tensions. It's nice when you can plan ahead that way. In real life, when you're talking to somebody about a live controversy, you don't usually have quite that privilege. And so it takes patience. And sometimes it's very difficult to effectively use the method that way. But what's hardest of all is to use it on yourself, as I've said. I mean, my view is that when Plato wrote the Socratic dialogues, he was basically thinking out hard problems for himself by putting different positions into the mouths of the people in these dialogues, like characters in a play or characters in a dream, who are all aspects of the self. He wasn't running around using the Socratic method all the time. He was trying to model, here's how you might think to yourself about a topic by going back and forth, as if you were having a conversation in your head. And the problem that you just raised, notice how difficult it is, especially when you're doing it to yourself. It's, in other words, the Socratic method between two people is a kind of setting of a gentle trap, where you seek assent to a proposition that's going to create unexpected trouble for something else the person thinks or has said. It's very hard to spring a trap on yourself by inviting your own assent to a proposition that will create trouble for something else you think. I think when you're doing it yourself, you simply have to patiently ask hard questions and try to imagine putting the questions to yourself that an adversary would put. I mean, that's how Mill thought about it. The Socratic method is really about taking whatever you think you believe and attacking it with all the force and persistence that a determined adversary would. Most people find that pretty uncomfortable. They don't want to do it. They'd rather be on Twitter reading other people who already think what they believe and just confirm it. And the idea that you would actually enjoy having other people contradict you, let alone doing it to yourself, this is just not human nature as it spontaneously occurs. And that's why Mill thought, and why I think the Socratic method is an antidote for all times and places, because in all times and places, nobody's ever enjoyed being contradicted, or nobody's ever been born that way. People can gradually learn, I think, to relish it. And that's part of what appreciating the Socratic method means, is that you come to think, I really enjoy going back and forth. I enjoy the pleasure of relinquishing a mistaken belief and realizing that I don't understand this as well as I thought I did. To me, that's what the culture should be in a well-run university, is people should really enjoy that moment when somebody asks them a question and they realize, my God, I might be wrong. That should be a wonderful moment, not a moment to dread. And I hope that life in a university conditions people to look forward to that and to appreciate people who do it and enjoy the moments when they're able to accomplish that for themselves.
I think you're describing the ideal university here, which would be
the ideal, right?
To be there. But I think you've got to learn to let go of the outcome, haven't you? You've got to not be so wedded to your personal commitment to your idea that you're not willing to let go of it if you prove to be self-contradictory in some way.
Right. But I mentioned, I'm sorry. Let me just respond briefly and say that I mentioned the Socratic method can be treated as a very practical thing, but also as a larger thing. As a larger thing, I think the Socratic method is a way to teach oneself the kind of humility you just mentioned, which is that after you've been through the Socratic method a lot, or read a lot of dialogues or been in them, what you come to realize is you're probably wrong a lot more often than you think. And so your own attachment to your beliefs becomes a little less firm. You're a little more ready to be wrong because you've learned the hard way that that's the human condition. And so your strength of confidence in a lot of your own beliefs goes from 100% or 99% to 60-40 or 80-20, because you've got to leave that residue of doubt because you've seen it so many times before.
Yeah. So let's just summarize a little bit. So the first, or maybe the primary point of entering into a Socratic dialogue is it's a collaborative effort to search for the truth And the first means of doing that is by seeking out internal contradictions in the statements which are being made. It's collaborative because you say we have to agree on certain points, and having firmed that ground up, you then search through the consequences of what you agree on to see where the contradictions might lie. Are there any other points or significant elements to the Socratic dialogue, or is that the whole thing?
Well, there's certainly more to it. One is a point you mentioned in passing, which seems obvious but has to be stressed, which is that if you're really going to engage in dialogue Socratically, your commitment has to be to the truth, as opposed to winning the argument or looking good or avoiding looking bad or making your adversary look bad. You have to actually, I think you have to take a minute to relinquish those goals, because they're very common. I mean, I think all of us actually desire all these things. We all want to look good, save face, get the better of whoever we're talking to because they seem so stupid we can't stand it. I think putting all that aside and thinking, look, I might be wrong, and if I'm wrong, I want to know it. And so I'm going to, in good faith, attempt to get to the bottom of this and try to unfold contradictions that might exist in the positions of the people I'm talking to, but also see where my own lie. I mean, my goal is to be consistent, and it's very hard to do. And it may be that I'm missing something. I mean, if somebody else is quite sure of something that seems quite wrong to me, it's not that I'm likely to decide they were right all along, but there's probably something in what they say, or there might be, and I need to understand that. So the good faith commitment to learning something from the dialogue on both sides, I think, is essential to making it go right. Not taking offense. Not giving offense is an important value in dialogue in our conversational culture. And I think a lot of people are very concerned about that, and they police themselves to avoid giving offense because of all the costs that come along with that. But not taking offense is actually a very valuable skill. And it's something that Socrates makes a point of saying in some of the dialogues, which is, if I'm wrong, I want to know it. Just tell me. You'll be doing me a great favor. I promise not to get mad. And I think basically conditioning yourself that if somebody contradicts you, you're going to treat it as a favor, not as a source of offense. That is an extremely important commitment for dialogue to get off the ground. Because if you don't have that, then instead of asking the hard questions, people are going to tiptoe around and try to make sure they don't say anything that rubs their interlocutor the wrong way. And then you never really get anywhere.
I think you put your finger on a particular issue in our society. For certainly over the past 20 or 30 years or so, the idea of taking offense, we've become super sensitive to that particular thing, as if taking offense is something we've got a master's degree in, or everyone has got a master's degree in it, so that they're very keen to spot even the slightest thing which could be taken. And that's certainly something which I think Socrates and his approach should help us to guard against. Yeah.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think people just need to view it as an impediment, offense giving or taking, even if taking the offense would seem justified, it's just an impediment to getting at the truth. Because once you're offended, it ends dialogue, it ends the search, it makes it hard to listen to the other person clearly. Even just putting offense aside until later, if you're thinking, I cannot not be offended by this, well, try to table that thought until later, so that just for the sake of trying to learn something.
The idea of a Socratic method often seems to involve two or more people, so that you have this dialogue between people. But is the Socratic method useful for individuals? Could you even say you could have the Socratic method that an individual holds a dialogue with him or herself?
Well, yes, that's what I was attempting to suggest a few moments ago. And another way to put it is, you can think of there's this concept of the executive function that's familiar from psychology, which is sort of the ability to delay gratification and make plans to be well organized and get things done. I propose the existence of something like a Socratic function in the self, which is the capacity for self-skepticism, to ask hard questions of yourself, to force yourself to reckon with contrary evidence. I think some people have a very well-developed Socratic function. Some people have a very poorly developed one. And to me, part of the process of good education is simply learning that instinct to put hard questions to yourself, take them slowly and seriously, and not be too quickly satisfied with your own answers to them. In other words, as I said a few moments ago, to be willing to question yourself as a vigorous adversary would.
Right. The that reminds me of another psychologist. There's many videos on YouTube of Jordan Peterson, who talks about thinking, and there's a very strong connection between what he says thinking is, I think, and this, which his idea is that thinking can only be done in dialogue with yourself, and you have to have one side of you which presents an argument and another side of you which strongly criticizes that argument, and then the other side comes back and answers the criticisms, and so on and so forth. And it's through the internal dialogue in your own mind that you enable you to think and push ideas forward, which sounds very similar to a Socratic method here.
It may be. I have to confess, I'm not familiar with what Jordan Peterson's had to say there, but what you're describing to me does sound Socratic, which is that it's the internal operation of dialogue, basically putting different possibilities into the mouths of imaginary dialogue partners for yourself is a very wholesome exercise. One way to do it is to write. I mean, if you take the time to write out your thoughts and write out objections to your thoughts and imagine it as a dialogue, almost like a play, in effect, you're doing what I think Plato was doing, which was trying to work out his own views about hard ethical problems by putting dialogue into the mouths of different aspects of himself. And I think that's a wholesome exercise for anybody.
Before we move on to the book, your other book, the Practicing Stoic, let me just ask about the application of this approach, the Socratic approach, to academic life, to university life, even to society in its wider context. How do you get the university or even society to start thinking in a more productive, critical way, so that we don't end up with lazy thinking and just jump to conclusions which may not be that valid?
Well, that's the problem for the ages. I think that in the sciences, actually, we have a better developed ethic that people test what they think and they welcome refutation of their findings. When we're talking about ethics or about things that do not lend themselves to that kind of proof, my wish would be that we had a kind of ethic of the scientific method that we apply to our thinking about those topics also. That's one way to think about what the Socratic method is. It's sort of the closest we can come to applying scientific method to our opinions about politics, morality, ethics, social problems, things like that. And I suppose I would just hope that within a university, dissent would have friends, and that people especially would find themselves concerned anytime they're in a room where everybody seems to agree, especially about a hard topic, what should be a hard topic, or a topic on which people disagree outside the room. My own view is that when everybody in a room is in a self-congratulatory mood about how well they understand something, that should raise concern, an instinctive concern, and it should make you want to raise oppositional points just for the sake of argument and say, well, look, what if somebody who didn't agree with this were here? What would they say? I just think every room needs a gadfly, and every room in which there isn't one should provoke an instinct for somebody to at least take on that role for the good of the group and say the unwelcome thing, raise the point of view that probably nobody in the room has or really wants to hear, and force everybody to take the time to deal with it. That is the instinct I would hope would develop within universities. And in some communities you have that, and some communities not so much. We can all think of university communities that are nothing like that, where everybody just sits around and agrees. And I think that's a kind of disease intellectually, is that a room where dissent is not welcome is a room that's going to lose track of the truth pretty quick.
Yes, and I mean, if anywhere should be a place of open debate, then the university's got the biggest claim for that, seems to me. That's where free and open debate ought to be.
Yeah, if you're not going to get it at a university, I don't know where you're going to find it.
Exactly, and nothing should be off the table. I mean, I know the universities are very strong on diversity, but diversity of thought must surely be one of the most important elements of diversity. The idea that you can sharpen each other's approach by testing different viewpoints. I know that Jonathan Haidt has particularly fostered a group of people called the Heterodox Academy for use within universities, where he promotes the idea that, this very idea that we should have people prepared to say opposing views, and that opposing views should be welcomed within the halls of academia, but often isn't.
Yeah. Well, I wish that went without saying. Maybe it does not go without saying. And I think that the idea of bringing in, the difficulty is if you're bringing in somebody deliberately because you want to broaden the range of opinions around the table, you're almost by definition bringing in somebody who most people think is wrong. And the question is, why would you do that? Why would you willingly do that? Since if they're wrong, all they can do is pollute the discussion. I think the only answer to that question is you've got to take more seriously the possibility there's something you might be missing, or that the truth might be something that is not in your exclusive possession. And once you have that humility, the idea that you'd want to bring in people who disagree for the sake of the common enterprise of getting closer to a truth that none of us exclusively has becomes more bearable, maybe even more desirable.
I think that probably sums it up. I think when you say none of us has that truth, that's a truism in itself. But unfortunately, many people think they have the truth, I think, in a particular area, and they jealously want to guard it and are afraid that someone will undermine it in some respect, and hence they become very defensive rather than very open. I think that may be where that comes from.
Yeah, there's this funny reversal where Socrates really believed there was such a thing as truth about hard ethical questions, but he didn't think he had it. He thought, that was why he was the wisest person in Athens, is because he didn't consider himself wise. He didn't think he had the truth. Everybody else did. But there's a kind of reversal now where people are very skeptical there is truth, and yet they act as if they're the only ones who have it. It's a funny turn of the tables.
I think that Karl Popper probably expressed it quite well, that we don't actually get to the final truth, but through a scientific method and through this kind of process, we can get closer to it, and we can know that we can get closer to it, even if we don't actually necessarily arrive at it. So we still have to keep that open mind.
Right. Yeah, I don't mean to suggest we don't get closer. I think we do, and that's our goal. But to get closer, you need the tension of dissent that forces you to refine what you think and points out why there might be something missing in your model of the world.
Okay. You've also written a companion book. In fact, you said the Socratic Method was a precursor to this particular book, which is the Practicing Stoic. Can you tell us something about that particular book and why you wrote that one?
Yes, so Stoicism is another widely misunderstood inheritance from classical times. The word Stoic in English, of course, has a common meaning of something like suffering without complaint or being unfeeling, something like that. Stoic philosophy really has very little to do with that stereotype suggested by the English word. I think it's the repository of some of the most practically valuable philosophical ideas developed in ancient Greece and in Rome. And my hope was to take some of the best, most useful of those ideas and sort of systematize them in a way they were not systematized in ancient times, so they'd be easier to understand now. The sources on Stoicism that come to us now, the ones that have lasted best, are mostly from ancient Rome. It's the writings of Epictetus, Seneca the Younger, Marcus Aurelius, and they never sat down and wrote out the ideas of the Stoics in a way that made them easy to learn. They would write, Marcus Aurelius kept a journal, Seneca would write letters or essays. Epictetus, we have some class notes from students of his, but nobody sat down and said, well, look, here are the key ideas from A to Z. My wish in the book was to do that, to make the ancient wisdom of the Stoics on ethical questions, as opposed to many others, more accessible by breaking them down and saying, on any given topic, here's what the different Stoics had to say about that topic, and here's how their views relate to each other, and here's what some descendants of the Stoics have said, like Montaigne or Schopenhauer, others who've been influenced by them. Right.
I mean, I've got, the chapters in your book cover those particular areas, including judgment, perspective, death, desire, wealth, pleasure, what others think, evaluation, emotion, those kind of aspects. Excuse me. But one point which stood out for me, because I was struggling trying to understand what Stoicism actually means. I mean, us Brits, we talk about a stiff upper lip, and that's the natural kind of idea of it. But there's something else here which sort of stood out at me, and I'm trying again to find the passage. It's the idea that it's not so much the things that come your way which you need to worry about. It's your own judgments about those things.
Yeah, so there's different ways to explain Stoicism and no right way to do it. But for me, the starting point from a practical standpoint is the insight you just mentioned, which is a very core idea in Stoicism. It's that we usually experience life as a set of things that happen that we react to. And the Stoic view is you don't actually react directly to what happens in the world. You react to your thoughts about what happens in the world. You react to your judgments about it. So if you're in a traffic jam and you're furious at the behavior of somebody else in another car, you're not really reacting to what they did. You're reacting to what you think about what they did, which might seem like a trivial observation, but it's not, because that intermediate, what's that?
I think that's quite a deep observation, really.
Yeah.
Quite profound.
Well, once you take it for all it's worth, what you realize is that your thought reaction to what's happening in front of you, that's something you have some control over. And it's not inevitable. It feels inevitable in the moment, but it's not. And part of what Stoicism is about is slowing down, observing that layer of judgment or thought that occurs between the event and your reaction to it, and questioning it really in Socratic fashion. The Stoics thought of themselves as descendants of Socrates and as putting his ideas to a kind of practical use. And in effect, that's what we're talking about. It's taking that intermediate step of thought and judgment that's the real source of your reaction and questioning it and asking about its rationality and whether it's serving you well. And once you slow down and do that in a Stoic way, it really just causes you to reconsider and think more carefully about all the things that we react to in life, all of our fears and desires. The Stoics put them all through a kind of Socratic testing and tames them so that somebody who studies Stoicism successfully becomes somewhat less attached to various desires they probably had before, less fearful of things that used to make them anxious. It's a very useful thing, much more so than most people think of the study of ancient philosophy as being.
Okay, so can I try and pin this down a bit more? What does the practicing Stoic do then from day to day? How does he implement that approach?
Well, I think there's a constant sorting as things come your way between aspects of events and problems that are up to you and aspects that are not. And so things that are not under your control, Stoics are very likely to relinquish any attachment to. They might still have interest in them, might work at them, but they don't get attached to that. What they get attached to is the quality of their own judgment, because that is the one thing that is absolutely under their control. And so you'd say, look, I can't control what other people do. I can't control these events external to me. What I can control is the quality of my own understanding and choice making, and that's going to be where my attachments lie. And so you end up getting much less, reacting much less strongly, perhaps, to external events and what other people say. Stoics are very hard to offend, because a typical Stoic would say, why would I give the power over my own mood and reaction to another person like that? I mean, it's like letting somebody else push you around physically. I wouldn't want them to do that. And I wouldn't want to let somebody throw me off by saying something that I didn't like. My equanimity, my tranquility, or my own peace of mind is a very valuable thing to me. And I'd rather be the person who's in charge of that rather than letting it be in the control of whoever says something that throws me. So Stoics tend to be very calm people, or people who study Stoicism. There are no finished Stoics. I mean, the model for the Stoic is the sage, who's the perfect model of all these values I'm describing. Well, nobody gets there. But by studying Stoicism, you can sometimes develop some of these qualities and characteristics to a greater extent. And I think it can be a real help in just dealing with some of the challenges of modern life.
So one of the key points then is understanding what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for, and and being able to distinguish those two things. It reminds me very much of Taoism and Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, which they teach that same kind of idea, that the 10,000 things come and the 10,000 things go, and you let them go. It's kind of, you're in this world which you're responsible only for yourself and for your reactions and your responses, and you need to master that. And the world around you is not something you should be subject to.
Yes, although I do want to say this, that I think another misconception about Stoicism is that since you're mostly focused on what you can control in terms of your own judgments, it's a kind of retiring philosophy where you lose interest in the world and just focus on you. That's quite false. The Stoics' view of ethics is that it's a very other-regarding philosophy, and that that human beings are interdependent, and that your obligation as an ethical person is to basically try to help others in every way you can. It's not a philosophy of retirement from the world. It's a philosophy of engagement from the world. On the other hand, you mentioned Taoism, and I will say that, when you study philosophical traditions, what you often discover is the sages in different traditions often arrive at many of the same conclusions by different routes, sort of like going up different faces of the same mountain. And I do think the Stoics arrive at a lot of the same views that are reached by great philosophers in other traditions, or even religious traditions. I would just say the Stoic route to those conclusions is a very rational route. So those who prize rationality and enjoy the life of the mind and of thinking your way to answers often find Stoicism a very agreeable way to arrive at conclusions that others might get at through faith or through other philosophical routes.
Okay. I mean, all of these ancient sages you mentioned, are there any modern day equivalents that you would draw our attention to? Is there anywhere else you might find a modern day equivalence of Stoicism spoken of or dealt with or presented in our society?
Well, it's funny that way. It's a tricky business because first of all, you're not going to find a finished Stoic in any society. And second of all, people who I think are really devoted to Stoicism tend to be notably hard to identify. Stoicism is a very non-self-aggrandizing thing. If somebody's crowing about what a fine or accomplished Stoic they are, rest assured they aren't, because that's part of Stoicism is the kind of Socratic humility that I mentioned. So I don't mean that Stoics tend to become invisible in the world, but often their Stoicism is not very visible because Stoicism is not a showy thing. So I wouldn't want to embarrass somebody by saying, well, there's an accomplished Stoic over there. That might out them or make them look like they haven't done a very good job after all. I think Stoicism's enjoyed a funny kind of vogue in recent years, where a lot of people have gotten interested in it and are benefiting from it. But I wouldn't want to point to anybody and say, now there's a good one. I think if you study it, what you realize quickly is how far most of us are from the way of the sage, and how far we all have to go.
Okay. And we're coming roughly to the end of our time, and thank you for time in talking to us today. Can I just ask you two last questions, one about Socrates and one about the Stoics? And it's really putting you on the spot, I suppose, a little bit, but could you give us one piece of advice, or what would be the central piece of advice to someone who wanted to learn to think for themselves? What's the key point on that?
I think in the first place, it's just humility and remembering that your odds of being wrong about things you feel strongly about are higher than you imagine. And the same goes for for others in your community who seem very sure of themselves and whose views you may have internalized. I think Socrates thought that's the basic state of humanity, is that wisdom lies in not believing you're in too strong a possession of it, so that you stay hungry to learn more and discover where you may have gone wrong.
And on the last question on the Stoic side, is there any one piece of advice you would give equivalently on how to live better? What would be the key point on that?
Well, I'm reluctant because I think I'm opposed to the reduction of such ideas to short statements. Maybe that's my advice in a nutshell, is don't be satisfied too easily with short attempts to put wisdom in a box. The real wisdom doesn't fit.
Ward Farnsworth, thank you ever so much for your time. And if you're interested in looking at these ideas further, then I can strongly recommend both of these books, The Socratic Method, which you can gain from Amazon. I think in English pounds, it's about £19 for that, but worth every penny of that. And the other one is the Practicing Stoic Philosophical User's Manual. Both of these claim to be user's manuals, and they are indeed that. They're very practical books and very, very well worth reading. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
It's been great to be with you. Thank you for having me.